The rain fell softly on the streets of Karachi, blurring the glow of streetlights. Onijah Robinson stood outside a large, gated house, her clothes soaked and clinging to her skin. Her hands trembled as she knocked again and again on the heavy wooden door. "Nidal!" she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. There was no response, only the distant murmuring of neighbours gathering to watch the scene unfold. Behind the curtains, Nidal stood silently, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to go out and face her, but fear and guilt held him back. He knew this moment would come, but not like this. He turned away from the window as his mother's disapproving voice echoed in his mind. 3 months earlier, things had been different, hopeful, even magical. Onijah had spent hours chatting with Nidal online, feeling as though she had finally found someone who truly understood her. Nidal was charming and attentive, always listening to her dreams and fears with patience. They shared late-night video calls, laughing over inside jokes and planning a future together. For Onijah, the bond seemed unbreakable. Nidal had promised to be there for her, to stand by her side no matter what. "Someday, you'll come here and we'll get married," he had said confidently. His words played over and over in her mind as she booked her ticket to Karachi, her heart swelling with excitement and anticipation. When she arrived at the airport, Nidal had been there waiting for her, but something felt off. His smile was hesitant, his eyes darting around nervously. Onijah noticed, but brushed it aside, thinking he was just overwhelmed. As they drove through the bustling streets, she tried to engage him in conversation, but he answered in short, vague replies. The tension grew when they reached his family home. Nidal's parents greeted her with forced politeness, their gazes sharp and unreadable. The atmosphere during dinner was heavy with unspoken words. Onijah felt every awkward glance, every whisper exchanged in a language she didn't understand. She tried to stay optimistic, convincing herself that things would get better once she and Nidal had some time alone. But the days passed, and Nidal became increasingly distant. He made excuses to avoid spending time with her. When she confronted him, he stumbled over his words, unable to look her in the eye. "It's my family," he finally admitted. "They don't approve of us." Onijah's heart sank. She had heard about cultural differences, but never imagined they would tear apart something she believed was so strong. "But you said you'd fight for us," she reminded him, her voice trembling. Nidal sighed and looked away. "I thought I could, but I was wrong. It's not that simple." The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Everything they had shared, the late-night calls, the promises, the dreams, felt like lies now. Nidal's words echoed in her mind as she sat alone in the small guest room they had given her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Her thoughts spiraled into despair as she tried to understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. Was it all just an illusion? Had he ever really loved her? Determined not to give up, Onijah took matters into her own hands. She showed up unannounced at Nidal's house, demanding to see him. His family refused to let her in. She camped outside for hours, refusing to move despite the stares and whispers from passers-by. "I'm not leaving until he talks to me," she declared, her voice hoarse but defiant. Her persistence caught the attention of the local media. Within days, her story went viral. Reporters swarmed the area, capturing footage of the heartbroken American woman stranded in a foreign land. Social media exploded with reactions, some sympathetic, others mocking. People debated endlessly. Was she a victim of betrayal, or was she delusional for thinking love could overcome such deep cultural divides? Nidal watched the chaos unfold from a distance, feeling trapped between loyalty to his family and the guilt that gnawed at him. He knew he had led Onijah to believe in a future he couldn't deliver. His heart ached, but he couldn't see a way to fix the situation without tearing apart everything he had been taught to honour and respect. As the days dragged on, he avoided her calls and messages, hoping the storm would pass. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. As the sun rose over the city, casting a soft golden glow over Karachi's rooftops, Onijah sat on the curb outside Nidal's house, her arms wrapped around her knees. The night had been long and cold, but her exhaustion was overshadowed by the ache in her chest. She scrolled through her phone, rereading old messages from Nidal, as if searching for clues she might have missed. "You're my soulmate, Onijah. I don't care what the world says." The words burned now. She could barely recognize the man who had sent them. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open, and she jumped to her feet, expecting Nidal. Instead, it was his mother. The older woman glanced at her briefly, her gaze cold, before closing the door again without a word. Onijah's shoulders slumped as she realized how unwanted she had become. The neighbors had started gathering again, murmuring and pointing. A few young men laughed as they recorded videos of her. She heard them joke in Urdu, but she didn't need a translation to know they were mocking her. Her face flushed, but she refused to leave. Her phone buzzed and she fumbled to answer it, hoping it was Nidal. But it was a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" "This is from the Sheepa Welfare Association," a man said. "We've been informed about your situation, and we're offering you a place to stay." Onijah hesitated. She didn't want to leave. What if Nidal came out while she was gone? What if this was her only chance to confront him? But the weight of the past few days pressed heavily on her, and she knew she couldn't keep sitting on the street indefinitely. She agreed to go with them, silently praying that Nidal would reach out before it was too late. The shelter was modest but clean, and the staff treated her kindly, offering her warm food and a place to rest. But even with the basic comforts, her mind refused to settle. As she lay on the thin mattress, memories of her time with Nidal flooded back. She could still hear his laughter, see the way his eyes lit up during their video calls. How had something that felt so real dissolved so quickly? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A staff member informed her that reporters were waiting outside, eager for an interview. Onijah rubbed her temples, feeling the pressure of the situation closing in on her. But she realized that this was her chance to be heard. If Nidal wouldn't listen to her privately, maybe he'd hear her through the media. The press conference was chaotic. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and journalists shouted questions over each other. "Why did you come to Pakistan? Did Nidal Memon promise to marry you? What do you want now?" Onijah took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "I came here because I loved him," she said firmly. "We had a plan. He told me to come and we'd start a life together. But now he's abandoned me." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I left everything for him. My job, my home, my family. And now I'm stuck here with nothing." The crowd murmured, some sympathetic, others skeptical. One reporter pushed forward and asked, "What do you expect from Nidal now?" For a moment, Onijah was silent. She wanted Nidal to apologize, to explain himself, to at least acknowledge the pain he had caused her. But she also knew that her demands went beyond just him. Her emotions boiled over as she replied, "I want justice. He shouldn't have led me on if he couldn't stand up for me. And I want help rebuilding my life. I trusted him, and now I'm suffering because of it." As the interview aired on television and spread across social media, reactions poured in. Some people rallied behind her, calling her a victim of betrayal and manipulation. Others criticized her, saying she had ignored obvious cultural barriers and set herself up for failure. "She's desperate for attention," someone commented under a viral video. Another person defended her. Imagine leaving your whole life for love and being treated like this. She's brave. Back in his room, Nidal scrolled through the comments, his heart racing. He felt suffocated by the overwhelming attention, but what stung the most were the harsh accusations aimed at him. Coward, liar, betrayer. His family had warned him not to get involved with someone from a different background, and now they were furious. "This is a disgrace," his mother said sharply. "Look at what she's done. You need to end this once and for all." But Nidal couldn't ignore the weight of guilt crushing his chest. The truth was, he hadn't intended to hurt Onijah. In the beginning, he had truly believed they could make it work. But as the reality of his family's expectations became clearer, he panicked. He had tried to push her away quietly, hoping she'd leave on her own. But Onijah's love wasn't the kind that faded easily. It clung to him like a shadow. That night, Nidal stared at his phone, her name glowing on the screen as he debated calling her. His thumb hovered over the dial button. He wanted to tell her everything, that he had loved her but wasn't strong enough to fight for her. But before he could gather the courage, his phone buzzed with another message from his mother. "Block her number. This ends tonight." With trembling hands, Nidal did as he was told. Tears welled up in his eyes as he watched her messages disappear from his screen. He knew this wasn't the end for him. It was only the beginning of regret. The air inside the shelter was still, but Onijah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory like a broken record. Her mind wouldn't let her rest. Even when her eyes closed, images of Nidal would haunt her. His smile, the warmth of his voice when he used to call her "my love." She remembered the nights when he would stay up past midnight just to talk to her, even though it was morning in Karachi. It felt so real then, but now the silence was suffocating. The man who had once been her everything had vanished, leaving her in pieces. The next morning, Onijah sat by the window, watching the city come to life. Children played in the streets, vendors called out their prices, and life moved on as if her world wasn't crumbling. Her phone buzzed, but it wasn't the call she was waiting for. Instead, it was another reporter asking for an interview. She ignored it. She didn't want to talk to the media anymore. She wanted to talk to Nidal. Desperation clawed at her insides. She considered calling him again, but the memory of her unanswered calls from the past few days held her back. Her heart twisted as she scrolled through social media. Videos of her standing outside Nidal's house had been viewed millions of times. Some comments were cruel. "She's just an attention seeker." Others broke her even more. "Poor woman. This is what happens when you trust the wrong person." Onijah put the phone down, her fingers trembling. How had her life become this public spectacle? People around the world were dissecting her pain, and she had no control over it. Suddenly, the shelter director knocked on her door. "There's someone here to see you," he said gently. Her breath hitched. Could it be Nidal? Was he finally here to explain, to make things right? She quickly wiped her face and rushed out, her heart pounding with hope. But when she reached the reception area, it wasn't him. It was a man in a suit, stern, middle-aged, and unfamiliar. He introduced himself as a representative from the US consulate. "We've been monitoring your situation, Ms. Robinson," he said. "We're here to help arrange your return to the United States." Onijah's heart sank. Return? Number she hadn't come all this way to leave empty-handed. She shook her head, her voice firm. "I'm not going back until I talk to Nidal." The man sighed, clearly expecting this response. "Ms. Robinson, you've been through a lot. We understand. But staying here in this state isn't safe for you. This media frenzy won't help you heal." "I don't care about the media," she snapped. I just want answers." The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. What if you never get them? The question hit her like a punch to the gut. What if Nidal never spoke to her again? What if he had already moved on, leaving her trapped in this emotional limbo while he carried on with his life? The thought made her knees weak, but she steadied herself. She wasn't ready to give up. "I need time," she whispered. The representative nodded, giving her a business card. "Call me when you're ready, but don't wait too long. This situation is only going to get harder." After he left, Onijah sat by herself in the small, dimly lit room, tears streaming down her face. She had never felt this lost before. Back in New York, she had always been able to fix things, whether it was a problem at work or a bad relationship. But here, in this foreign land, she was powerless. Everything was slipping away, and she couldn't hold on. The sound of her phone buzzing jolted her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she checked the screen, hoping to see Nidal's name. But it was just another notification from a news outlet covering her story. Frustrated, she threw the phone onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. She hated how connected she still felt to him, how her heart refused to let go despite everything. That evening, while wandering through the shelter's courtyard, she saw a group of women sitting together, sharing stories. One of them waved her over, and though she hesitated, she eventually joined them. The conversation was light at first, discussing food, weather, and family. But eventually, one of the women asked, "Why are you really here, Onijah?" The question was simple, but it cut deep. She had asked herself the same thing many times since she arrived. Was it love, desperation, stubbornness? She didn't know anymore. "I thought love would be enough," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The women listened quietly, their eyes filled with understanding. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned in closer. "Sometimes we think love can save us," she said softly. "But sometimes it breaks us first." The words lingered long after the conversation ended, echoing in Onijah's mind as she returned to her room. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling once again. For the first time, she allowed herself to question whether Nidal had ever truly loved her, or if she had been in love with the idea of him. The answer scared her. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, her phone buzzed again. She ignored it at first, assuming it was another reporter. But then, something told her to check. When she picked up the phone, her breath hitched. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow at the park. I'll explain everything." Her heart pounded as she reread the message, her mind racing. Could it be Nidal? Or was this another cruel twist in a story that had already broken her? She had no way of knowing, but one thing was certain. She wasn't ready to give up just yet. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window, bathing the room in soft warmth. But Onijah felt anything but calm. She hadn't slept much after reading the message. Her mind had cycled through countless possibilities. What Nidal might say, whether he'd even show up, and if this meeting would finally give her the closure she desperately needed. As she stood in front of the mirror, her hands trembled while brushing her hair. Her reflection stared back, tired and fragile, but there was still a spark of determination in her eyes. This was her last chance to confront the man who had turned her life upside down. The park was quiet that morning, with only a few joggers and families walking along the paths. Onijah found a bench near a cluster of trees, her heart pounding with every passing second. The scent of blooming flowers mixed with the crisp morning air, but she could hardly appreciate it. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag as she scanned the area, searching for any sign of him. Minutes felt like hours, and doubt began to creep in. What if it wasn't Nidal who had sent the message? What if this was another cruel joke, another twist in this nightmare that refused to end? But then she saw him. Nidal walked toward her, his head lowered as if he were ashamed to even be there. He looked different. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by hunched shoulders and hesitant steps. When he finally reached the bench, he sat beside her, leaving a noticeable gap between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, filled with all the words they didn't know how to say. Onijah broke the silence first. Her voice was soft but firm. "Why did you do this to me, Nidal?" He exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for too long. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you, but you did." Her voice trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. "You told me to come. You made me believe in a future with you, and then you abandoned me like I meant nothing." Nidal's gaze remained fixed on the ground. "I loved you, Onijah. I still do. But love wasn't enough. My family, they would never accept you." Her breath hitched and she wiped her tears away with the sleeve of her shirt. "You knew that before I came, didn't you? You knew this wouldn't work, but you let me come anyway." "I thought I could convince them," he admitted. "I thought if they saw how much I cared about you, they'd change their minds. But it wasn't that simple. They made it clear that if I chose you, I'd lose them." Onijah laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and broken. "So, you chose them. You threw me away to protect your family's honor." Nidal finally looked up, and she saw the guilt etched into his features. "It wasn't just about honor. It was about survival. My family controls everything. My job, my future. If I lost them, I'd have nothing." "And what do you think I have now?" She shot back, her voice rising. "I left everything for you. I have no job, no home, and no one to turn to. All because I believed in you." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, shaking her head. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't pretend you care now." "I do care," he insisted. "I cared from the beginning, but I was a coward, Onijah. I thought ignoring you would make things easier for both of us." "Easier for you," she corrected. "Not for me. Do you know what it's like to be humiliated in front of the world? To have strangers mock your pain while the person you loved hides behind a closed door?" Nidal closed his eyes, as if her words were too painful to hear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know that I never meant for things to end this way." Onijah stared at him, searching for sincerity in his words. She could see the regret, but regret wasn't enough. It wouldn't bring back the life she had left behind or erase the pain she had endured. "What do you want from me now, Nidal?" she asked quietly. "I don't want anything," he replied. "I just want you to be okay. I want you to go back home and rebuild your life." Her chest tightened. "And what about you? Will you go back to your perfect life like none of this ever happened?" "It won't be perfect," he admitted. "I'll have to live with this regret for the rest of my life." For a moment, she considered what he had said. She'd come to Karachi searching for love, but all she had found was heartache. And now, as she sat beside the man who had once promised her the world, she realized that holding on to him would only keep her trapped in the past. "I loved you," she said softly, her voice filled with both pain and finality. "But I can't keep loving someone who wasn't brave enough to fight for me." Nidal didn't argue. He simply nodded, tears streaming down his face as he accepted her words. "I'm sorry," he repeated, but this time Onijah didn't respond. She stood up, her legs shaky but determined. She didn't look back as she walked away, leaving Nidal sitting alone on the bench, his head in his hands. The sun had risen higher in the sky by the time she left the park, casting a warm glow over the city. For the first time in days, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, even if just a little. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more tears, more nights spent questioning her choices. But as she stepped into the bustling streets of Karachi, she also knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived here 3 months ago. She had been broken, but she wasn't defeated. This time, she wasn't leaving for Nidal. She was leaving for herself. The airport was crowded, a sea of people moving in every direction, but Onijah felt like she was walking in slow motion. Her suitcase rolled behind her, the wheels clicking softly against the floor as she made her way through the terminal. She clutched her boarding pass tightly, her knuckles turning white. This was it, the moment she had dreaded and hoped for all at once. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the memories she carried were trying to anchor her to the ground. As she approached the security checkpoint, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. A part of her still clung to the possibility that Nidal would show up, rushing through the crowd, calling her name, begging her to stay. But the only people she saw were strangers, preoccupied with their own journeys. She took a deep breath and turned away, forcing herself to move forward. The hum of the airport faded into the background as her mind replayed the conversation they had shared at the park. She had walked away from him, leaving his apologies and regrets behind, but his words still echoed in her head. I'll have to live with this regret for the rest of my life. Was that supposed to bring her comfort? She didn't know. What she did know was that she couldn't carry his burden anymore. She had carried enough. His promises, his betrayal, his absence. Now, she needed to let it all go. After passing through security, she found a quiet corner near her gate and sat down. Her phone buzzed with another notification, but she ignored it. She couldn't handle any more headlines or sympathy messages. Instead, she stared out the large glass windows overlooking the runway, watching planes take off and disappear into the clouds. Soon, she'd be on one of them, leaving behind the city that had given her both hope and heartache. But even as she tried to focus on the future, the past clung to her like a shadow. She remembered the night Nidal had first told her he loved her. They had stayed up talking until dawn, discussing everything from their favourite foods to their dreams for the future. He had painted such a beautiful picture of their life together, one filled with laughter, adventure, and unconditional love. It had felt so real back then, so attainable. She had believed every word, letting his dreams become her own. Now, those dreams lay shattered, like glass scattered across a cold, unfamiliar floor. She blinked back tears, silently cursing herself for being so naive. But even as the pain threatened to consume her, a small voice inside her reminded her that she had survived. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, and loss. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, and strong enough to walk away. That had to mean something. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, pulling her out of her thoughts. She stood up, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and made her way toward the gate. As she handed her boarding pass to the attendant, she felt a strange sense of release, as if the act of stepping onto that plane was symbolic of something greater. She wasn't just leaving Pakistan, she was leaving behind the version of herself that had lived only for someone else's love. The plane was cool and quiet as she settled into her seat by the window. She watched the ground crew move around below, loading luggage and preparing for takeoff. The hum of the engines vibrated beneath her feet, steady and reassuring. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of control. She had made a choice, one that wasn't influenced by Nidal, his family, or the expectations of others. This was her decision, and it felt empowering, even amidst the lingering ache in her chest. As the plane taxied down the runway, her phone buzzed again. She debated whether to check it or turn it off, but curiosity got the better of her. When she unlocked the screen, her breath hitched. It was a message from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakably from Nidal. "I'm sorry. I'll never forget you. I hope you find happiness." Tears blurred her vision as she read the message over and over. She wanted to reply, to say something that could bring closure to this chapter of her life, but no words felt right. After a moment, she turned off her phone and tucked it into her bag. His apology was too late, and she wasn't going to let it pull her back into a world of what-ifs. The plane picked up speed, the vibrations growing stronger until the wheels lifted off the ground. As Karachi faded into the distance, Onijah leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the past slowly slipping away, replaced by a quiet but powerful resolve. She didn't know what awaited her in New York, but she knew she wouldn't make the same mistakes again. This time, she would build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's promises. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, cutting through the clouds, she whispered softly to herself, "I'm going to be okay." The words weren't a plea or a hope. They were a promise.